Oh,
Okay, I've had several requests on wintering, so I'm going to talk briefly about it, but it's kind of hard for me to talk very authoritatively about how to winter bees in a climate I've never really even lived in, let alone kept bees in. But I'll give you some advice based on the climates I have kept them in. Pretty much I've only had bees in western Nebraska, eastern Nebraska, and Laramie, Wyoming, and I had some for a year in Colorado. But that's not that different from Laramie. Actually, it was just like Laramie, only nicer. Because 7,200 feet down to 5,200 feet, and a little further south is just a little less dramatic. But I always had people bugging me about this, and so I don't actually have a presentation put together on it, but we'll just talk about it because everybody seems interested. I kind of hesitated to write a lot about wintering because it's just so dependent on locality. What I do in Nebraska may or may not work well here. I have no clue. But I'll tell you what I'm doing and why, and hopefully maybe that will shed some light on it. Here's some of the issues, in my opinion. One of the things is you got to keep mice out of the hives in winter. And I assume that's true anywhere you actually have winter, and I think you have winter here. We don't have much of a winter. I probably would call it spring where I am, but we had snow on May the 1st this year, so probably what you have is what I call spring, but we'll call it winter just for sake of semantics. If you have any kind of winter where the bees are going to be dormant and they're not going to be flying, the mice are going to want to move in. Mice are warm-blooded. Bees are kind of cold-blooded. As a superorganism, they're kind of warm-blooded. They get together and generate some heat, but they're not very active. They just have to stay in this cluster in order to keep warm. So they're not very active, and the mice tend to move in, and then the mice tend to devastate a lot of things. Mice are hard on a hive. I've heard people say that the mice only move into weak hives. That has not been my experience. They'll move into any hive. As long as it's dormant, they get a chance, they'll get moved in, and they'll just start ripping it all the heck while the bees are dormant. And then hide in the nest whenever it warms up enough that the bees are active. They get, they're all covered up with grass and whatever to protect them from the bees. And they'll just sit tight and wait for the weather to get cold again, and then they'll start tearing stuff up again. And they'll eat bees, and they'll eat honey, and they'll eat pollen, and they'll eat whatever, and make a mess, and it smells terrible. But back when I had bottom inferences, I just take 1/4-inch hardware cloth and cut a strip, and you can either bend it and make kind of an L and shove it into the entrance, or you can actually cut it to fit exactly across and set it down and staple it onto the front to make it clear. 1/4-inch seems to work. Now, in theory, a mouse ought to be able to squeeze through that, but I really haven't had a lot of trouble with mice squeezing through it. I think they can squeeze through a 1/4-inch crack maybe, but I don't think they can squeeze through a 1/4-inch hole. That's a different ballgame. I've heard of people using 1/2 inch. It seems to me a mouse would get through that. I don't know. I've heard people complain on a 1/4-inch they'll lose some of their pollen coming in, and that's true. They will lose some of it. But they can get through it without losing pollen. It's just that some of them get sloppy and they drag their leg across that wire. It'll catch that pollen and pop it out of their pollen pocket. But I haven't seen that to be a big problem. If I don't put these on until it's kind of fall anyway, there's not a lot of pollen coming in then, and by spring, when I see pollen coming in, I just pull them off. So that's what I did back when I had bottom inferences. I don't run bottom inferences anymore, so I don't even have to worry about them. But if you have bottom inferences, you need to do something. Another thing that's popular in Nebraska, it seems like, is they'll take a piece of plywood and cut it the width of the entrance, which is basically, 16¼ minus 1.5 inches, whatever that is. And about 4 inches wide out of 3/8 inch plywood, and then they'll cut 3 strips of lath that are that same 4 inches that is wide, and they'll put them in the middle and on each end. So it makes I don't have anything that, basically got this piece of plywood then with a lath and a lath and a lath that are going this way. So it makes an entrance here and an entrance here, and the lath is holding it up 3/8 of an inch. Does that make sense? You slide that into the entrance, and now it's a baffle that goes back 4 inches. And part of what that does is it cuts down on the draft coming in the door. So the air isn't just blowing right up through the door and up into the hive. It's got to go back 4 inches before it can make the turn to get up in here. So that tends to make less of a draft at the door. The other thing it does is it makes it only a 3/8 of an inch wide slit that's 4 inches long. Now, I would think that a mouse could get through that, because I've seen mice get through holes that were only that wide, but the fact that it's 4 inches long seems to deter them, because they not only have to get through it, they have to get through it for 4 inches, and they tend to not want to go that far. So it seems to work well for a mouse guard, plus it kind of works to cut down on the wind blowing in the front door. Does that make sense? Now that's what the three, bottom boards, most bottom boards anymore are reversible bottom boards. That means on one side it's got a 3/4 inch gap, on the other side it has either a 1/2 inch or a 3/8 inch gap. So if you have the 3/4 inch side up, this thing will fit under it and leave a 3/8 inch opening while you're using the 3/4 inch bottom. That makes some sense? Okay. Okay, queen excluders. If you're using queen excluders, you definitely want to take them off over the winter because the queen can get stuck on the other side of them. I say off, you can put them on the very top, as long as the bees aren't going to go through it and leave the queen behind. It doesn't matter where you put them. I don't run excluders anymore, except when I'm doing queen rearing, but basically if you've got excluders on the hive, you want them off in the winter. Because they're down here in the middle, and you got honey up here, and you got the brood down here, and the cluster is liable to move through here and leave the queen behind. They don't know that she can't get through. They just know it's warm up there and the food's up there, and they go up there, and they don't know why she didn't come with them. So, screen bottom boards. This probably is very dependent on climate, and I don't know what to tell you in your climate. But frankly, everything's all in the details, right? Most of my hives are sitting on a 3.5 inch stand with grass growing up in front of them. So there's not a lot of wind blowing under my screen bottom boards. And I don't have all screen bottom boards, but I have about half the screen bottom boards. There's not a lot of wind blowing under them anyway. But I probably tend to put the trays in, especially if they're on the ends and the wind might blow under them. But mine are sitting real close to the ground. If you got yours sitting up on a block this far off the ground and it's totally exposed, I would put a tray in there, something in there, so the wind isn't blowing in the hive. But maybe the wind doesn't blow around here. I mean, Nebraska, a calm day is 20 miles an hour wind. That's just a calm day. That's not a windy day. A 30 mile an hour wind, well, it's breezy today. A 40 mile an hour wind, that's a windy day. A 60 mile an hour wind, well, that's a storm. And a 100 mile an hour wind, that's a serious storm. And I've had many 100 mile an hour wind in my front yard that snapped trees right off in the full-grown trees, just snapped them right off. But so maybe my idea of windy isn't the same as your idea of windy. I don't know. But my idea of windy is 60 mile an hour winds, and it's 20 below. So maybe that's not the same as yours. But I think all that cold air coming in is not going to do them well when they're trying. Early in the spring, they're going to want to start raising some brood, and if that brood gets chilled, you're going to end up with some chalk brood. So I think you want to avoid that. Wrapping. I've got a little more information on wrapping in some of my other, and maybe I'll do one of those presentations too, and maybe we'll talk about it more. But the only time I ever tried wrapping, it just seemed to seal all the moisture, and the moisture is a bigger problem for me in the winter than cold is. So not that cold isn't a problem, but the wrapping seemed to just seal in all the moisture, and that just seemed to cause more problems. So I couldn't see that it was beneficial. I do think it's beneficial to put the hives together. Again, though, I've got a lot more brutal winter than you do, but my hives are all up against each other. So I've got 14 hives all in a clump. There are 2 rows of 7 that are all up against each other this way and up against each other this way. So they've got a lot less exposed area to lose heat to than if I just had them each on an individual stand with nothing but 20 degrees below zero air around them. Instead, they're all up against each other. So I think that makes a lot of difference in keeping them warm through the winter, especially if it's a more marginal colony. I've started trying to overwinter a lot more marginal colonies than I used to. I used to always combine them, and I bought into the, I'm going to take my losses in the fall stuff, but it's so nice to have another queen in the spring that I started overwintering nukes. And if I overwinter nukes, if I cluster them all together, I can get them through in an average winter, if there is such a thing. A brutal winter might do them in, But I can give it a shot, and maybe I can get 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 nukes through the winter and have them in the spring. And that's that many more queens I've got, and that many more colonies I've got that are actually really ready to go. So I cluster them all together.
Is that all year or just in the winter?
Mine are all always clustered together. The way my stands are built, it's 4 foot this way, but I've got the rails that they're sitting on such that I can slide it up to the front of the 4 foot here, which leaves 8 inches. If you slide both of them out, it leaves 8 inches in the back. If you slide both of them back, then there's no 8 inches. So as I happen to be working the hives, I tend to pull them out so that I can get my hands in there to work, to get a hold of the hive and pull them out. I can slide it forward really easy on my stand, so I just kind of slide it a little forward, and I slide this one a little forward. Pretty soon, by the middle of summer, usually there's an 8-inch gap down the middle and the back to make it easier for me to work them, and in winter, I shove them back together. So they're kind of still together. There's only, there's about 8 inches of give and take that I can play with to make them easier to work in the summer, and then slide it back together for the winter. Does that make sense? I never understood people who want to feed their bees all winter. First of all, I don't think it can be done. At least where I live, it can't be done. Once the syrup's down to 50 degrees, you can't feed them anyway. So they won't take it. If a bee sucks down 50 degrees syrup, they just get paralyzed because their wing muscles won't work anymore. Now they, so, and it's the syrup that has to reach that. So if you're feeding them syrup, and it gets down to 30 at night, and it gets up to 60 in the daytime, that syrup never makes it to 50 degrees. It's still 35, 40 degrees come the middle of the day. So they really can't take it anyway, and it's just going to spoil. I don't really understand the point of trying to feed syrup in the winter. And besides, what you really ought to do is leave them enough honey to get through the winter, and then you won't need to be feeding them. The other problem with feeding, I think, is a lot of people, they think that there's no downside to feeding. You can just feed and feed and feed and feed, and everything will be fine. The fact is, the bees need a place to cluster, and if they fill all of the comb where they need to cluster up, then they can't really cluster. Because the way they cluster is they go in the cells. There's this myth that if they die head first in the cells, they starve. Well, if they died head first in the cells, they died. I mean, they died in the cluster. That's the way the cluster is. They're head first in the cells. So whether they starved or whether they died from varroa or whether they died from whatever, if they die head first in the cells, that's the way a cluster is. The cluster died. And whether it was the 27 below that did them in because they couldn't generate enough heat, or whether they starved to death, they're still going to be head first in the cell because that's how they cluster. So what you got is these walls of comb. If you picture a cluster of bees in a colony in the winter, you have these walls of comb, and the cluster is in the aisles between the frames, right? But they also have to be in the cells, otherwise there's no density to this cluster, and it can't generate enough heat to keep them warm. So the bees stick their heads in the cells, and work their wing muscles to generate heat, and then when they get hungry, they pull themselves back out and work their way out to the outside and exchange some food with some of the ones on the outside, or they go get some stores, and then they work their way back into the middle and stick their heads back in the cells, and so you have this concentrated cluster of bees. Well, if you fill all those combs full of honey, there's nowhere for them to cluster. So you can feed them too much. You don't want to feed them so much that they fill up the space where they need to cluster. You do want to feed them enough that they have enough weight to get them through the winter. And that's perhaps the toughest thing to get across. For some reason, all the bee books and most of the advice I hear from almost everybody is based around, well, you have this many boxes and it should weigh this much. But that doesn't say anything about how many bees you have. And if I've got a cluster of bees this big, there's no point putting that in 2 deep boxes that weigh 120 pounds because there's no way they're going to eat anywhere near any of that. So you really ought to be looking at the size of the cluster of bees and make sure that size of the cluster of bees has enough food for that much bees for the winter, not just that every hive has to weigh 120 pounds or whatever the going rate is around here. There probably is a going rate around here if you talk to beekeepers for a typical Italian hive that's built up really well and didn't get split late and is still kind of small. There's probably some number, and that number is probably expecting about 8 or 9 frames of bees in a cluster and getting them through your winter. And what that number is, I don't know. But if you had that, divide that with about 8 or 9 frames of bees, and you've got maybe how much you need per frame of bees, and then you might be able to come up with a meaningful formula, because 5 frames of bees don't need as much food as 8 frames of bees. So, yes.
I was wondering if there was any data about how much, like the rate of consumption on a 60-degree day.
Unfortunately, I think winters are just too, they're too unpredictable. The things that cause them to eat more or less are too unpredictable. They probably eat the least at about 40 degrees. They probably don't eat that much more at 20 degrees. But so from 20 to 40, they're pretty inactive and they're not burning a lot of food. You start getting down to 20 below, they're burning a lot just to stay warm. And if you start getting up to 60, they get active and they start flying and looking for stuff to see if anything's blooming, and then they start burning a whole lot more honey. But how do you figure that in? I don't know if you can. I think you just have to take the estimates that you're getting from local people who are overwintering bees as a general concept of compared to other places. This is about what a full Italian cluster going into winter is going to burn up over the winter. Who knows what the weather will be like. You'll get some nice days, you'll get some cold days, you'll get whatever you get. You won't know what you'll get until you get it anyway. So,
Is there anything that says how much one bee eats in a typical day, like in the summer? I mean, is there any data on that?
somebody's probably done it. I don't know. Obviously, depends on what they're doing.
Well, I can't remember where I read years and years ago, but they figured out an average hive made and consumed about 800 pounds of honey per year.
That's probably true, because when you figure what they're burning up, flying out to the flowers and flying back, and what they're burning up, feeding the brood and raising the brood, there's a lot that gets consumed. For every frame of bees they raise, they've burned up a frame of honey and a frame of pollen. It's a lot of honey by the end of the year, but it depends on what that bee's doing. If that bee's feeding brood, they're going to go through a whole lot more food than if they're just biding their time waiting in the winter. Or they might even burn less food than the one that's out foraging, although they're burning a lot just flying out and flying back. But yeah, it's hard to say. One bee isn't going to burn the same amount as another bee, depending on what they're doing. If you are going to feed, because they're going to be too light, I think you want to feed it about as thick as you can get it to mix, because it's that much less work for the bees to dry it out. But I have trouble getting anything more concentrated than 5 to 3. I have trouble getting it to dissolve. So I pretty much end up doing 5 to 3. 2 to 1 is really difficult to get it to dissolve where I am. When the bees get done, it's all going to be 4 to 1. They're going to dry it out, but they have to do the work to dry it out. And so if you give it to them as 1 to 1, they have that much more work to do to dry it out. And yes, they'll take it faster. And there's people who measure how successful they think they are by how fast they take it, and they want to feed the 1 to 1 because they take it faster than the 2 to 1. But the 2 to 1's got twice as much sugar in it. So if they take it half as fast, they're still getting the same amount of sugar, and they're probably doing less work. So I wouldn't judge it just by how fast they take it. I'd judge it by do they weigh enough to get through the winter is really what you want, and how much am I making them work to get there. So the other thing about the thicker the honey is, the better. The thicker the syrup is, the better it keeps. If you make 2 to 1 syrup, it keeps way better than 1 to 1 syrup. 5 to 3 keeps pretty well. 1 to 1 doesn't keep very well at all. It ferments really quickly. So I really never feed 1 to 1. It's just it spoils too easy, and I don't think it has any advantage over 2 to 1 or 5 to 3. If you're going to feed them honey, because you don't want to feed them sugar syrup, I wouldn't water it down. Because if you water it down, you just make it ferment faster. If you can feed honey about any way you can feed syrup. Some people are dead set against feeding honey. My main reason for not wanting to feed honey is it tends to set off robbing. Other than that, I kind of like feeding honey, but there's the issue of, am I going to spread diseases and whatever. I guess I'm a big believer in the germ theory of health. I think spreading germs is a good thing. You should get all the germs you can from all the healthy people you can find to hang around with. You'll be a lot healthier. You probably don't want to hang around sick people and get all their germs, but that's another matter. So the real question about feeding bees is you ought to come up with a target weight or a target for how many capped combs you want or whatever, and feed to that target and then stop. If you need to feed at all, then feed to what it is they need. This feeding just because I want to do it just in case what's the just in case? You know, if they don't need food, then leave them alone. If they're going to be short and you're pretty sure they're going to starve, well, then you probably ought to feed them. But I don't think I'd feed them just in case. My plan, though, is to leave them enough honey. Now, sometimes that takes a little more, it takes a change in your management style, perhaps. If you harvest late, you can see if the fall flow is even going to happen, and you have a better idea what to leave them for winter than if you harvest early. If you harvest really early and you take all their honey and then the fall flow doesn't come through, maybe that's not a problem here, but where I am, the fall flow's iffy. Some years we have a really, some years you get a crop off of fall flow, and some years you get nothing. Because there's a drought might start in June and run all the way to winter. Or it might just be a little bit of a dip in how much it rained in July, and maybe it starts raining really nice and you get a really good crop in the fall. I never know what I'm going to have until fall's over, so I'd rather harvest after the fall flow's pretty much over and I have a better idea what to leave them. But so that's kind of my plan. And the other reason I want to do it then is if I wait till there's been a hard freeze, it pretty much kills the wax moths, so I don't have to worry about wax moths. So now I can harvest, I can put my boxes back out, I just stack them back up out in the bee yard on a bottom board with a top on them to keep the mice out. And I don't have to worry about the wax moths because I already had a hard freeze. The wax moths are dead. I'm done with them. Now, the problem with harvesting when it's cold out is, of course, you got to let that warm up before you can extract it because it's not going to come out when it's still cold. You're going to have to leave it in a warm room for a couple of days till it's warm enough that you can extract it. I've never understood the concept that feeding can't hurt, because I think I've caused more beekeeping problems by feeding than any other thing I've ever done. So I wouldn't say it can't hurt. It can cause all kinds of problems. It can set off robbing, it can attract ants, it can drown bees. I think I've caused more problems feeding probably than anything else I've ever done. So I don't quite understand that theory. And we already talked about a place for them to cluster, and if feeding is not really your typical management, in other words, you're trying to manage them so they don't need to be fed, then there's no point wasting a lot of money buying a bunch of feeders. If you buy solid bottom boards in the first place, and you can convert them to a feeder, and if you do need a feeder, you can use them, and then if you don't, you can just use them as a bottom board, and it'll save you some money and some time. If you go to my website, this is under wintering here, but there's also under feeding, you'll find a section on a bottom board feeder. Jay Smith originally invented well, if he didn't invent it, he wrote about it. He was the first guy to write about it. You never know who invented what, but they learned from somebody else. And I don't know that he ever claimed he invented it or not. I don't remember. But anyway, he was a big proponent of a bottom board feeder. Basically, you just make a dam to hold the syrup so it doesn't run out of the bottom. And I drill a hole in it and put a plug in it. And I can pull the plug out. If rain gets in there, it can run out the hole where the plug would go. And then if I want to put syrup in it, I put the plug in and pour the syrup in. And then the syrup's just on the bottom, and they just go down and eat the syrup. And does it drown bees? Every method I know of feeding bees drowns bees. It probably drowns the same number of bees as a frame feeder, which is sad, but it works all right. Dry sugar is probably the only method I know of that doesn't drown bees. It's probably not that different from a candy board or fondant, except that you don't have to work as hard. I never understood working that hard. I'm too lazy. But dry sugar on the top of you just put a newspaper on top of the hive, put a box on top of that, the sugar on top of that. I put a layer of sugar and spray it a little with water to get it to clump up so it won't run through like sand through an hourglass if the bees chew through the paper, you know. And then I try to get the front edge kind of damp so that they'll recognize it as food, because sometimes the house bees will start hauling it out for trash if you don't. You want them to recognize that it's food. But the nice thing about putting dry sugar on rather than feeding them syrup is if they don't need it, they don't tend to eat it. And you can take it all out and dump it in a bucket and use it again next year if they don't need it. If you're iffy and you're like going to feed just in case, I'd rather do this just in case than feed them a bunch of syrup. It's going to just disrupt all the microbes and clog up the clustering space and the brood nest and whatever. I may cause less problems doing this. On the other hand, they don't treat it the same as syrup. Syrup is like there's a flow, and they may raise another last batch of brood, which may be a good thing going into winter, to get that last batch of young brood. Syrup does have some other effects, but it also has some other downsides, so.
What about dried sugar in a top bar? How would you do that?
I've done it, but I can't say I've ever come up with a good way I really liked. Problem is, if it ends up on the bottom, it tends to get trash on it, and then they tend to treat it as trash, and they don't tend to treat it as food. Still, if they're starving, they'll tend to eat it before they'll starve. If I were going to try and feed it in the top bar, I'd probably build a big wide frame feeder, basically, you know, like you'd build a frame feeder to put syrup in and just fill it full of dry sugar. And then they can crawl in and eat the sugar, or they can put that up against the cluster. They can just crawl over in there and get sugar if they need to. It works well on top, which you can't really do on the top bar hive, because the cluster is up here at the top, so they're kind of already in contact with it, where if it's in a top bar hive this way, they're not really working their way up to where that is. And so you kind of have to get it up against the cluster, or they'll probably never find it when they're desperate for food. So, yeah, I'd probably get it. Some people make a frame of candy and put it in a top bar hive, and that would probably work, but it sounds like a lot of work. I don't know. Condensation is a big issue in winter in most climates, I think. In western Nebraska, it wasn't so much of a climate of a problem. In Laramie, it wasn't a problem. But in eastern Nebraska, it is. And we're not that humid compared to you. You're way more humid than we are. So I would say condensation is probably an even bigger issue where you are. In the winter, you get a lot of condensation dripping on the bees, and then they're wet and cold. And wet and cold is really rough. It takes a lot of heat to evaporate water off of you to get dry again. And it's the same for the bees. They have to generate enough heat to dry all that water, or they die because they're going to be too cold. So moist air rises. I know that seems backwards to people because it seems like water's heavier than air, therefore moist air should be heavier, but it's not. It's lighter. Moist air is lighter than dry air. And warm air, of course, is lighter than cold air. And so the bees are generating moist air by metabolism because they're burning sugar and they're producing carbon dioxide and water. And that carbon dioxide and water is warm and it's moist and it tends to go up. And if you have a top entrance, it doesn't have to be a big top entrance, but if you have a top entrance, it lets that moist air out the top. Now you don't want to let all the warm air out the top, obviously, so maybe you want to reduce that down to a couple of inches wide. But if you have some kind of a top entrance to let that moisture out, it's usually a lot better way to get them through the winter and keep the condensation down. Another thing that keeps the condensation down is put some insulation on it. Anytime condensation is caused by warm air contacting something colder. So the less cold it is, the less condensation you have. So if you put insulation on the top of the lid, then it's less cold, and so there's less condensation. Another issue is, if it's flat and it condenses on it, it's going to tend to drip right on the bees. If it's got some slope to it, it's going to tend to condense on it and then run down the back. So the way I have my top entrance hives set up, there's a little bit of tilt to the roof, and so there's a little more likelihood that if it condenses, it might run back and run down the back instead of dripping right on the bees. There's this big idea that the cluster always starts at the bottom and works their way up. By about this month or next month, my bees are usually all in the top boxes. That's where they spend the winter. That's where they always spend the winter. And everybody I've talked to in Nebraska says the same thing. And they were doing that when I had bottom entrances, and they do that now that I have top entrances. It doesn't seem to make any difference. That's where they spend the winter. I imagine that's because that's where the warmth is. The hot air rises, and that's where the warmth is, and so they go there. I don't know, but all the books seem to tell you that they're supposed to be in the bottom box going into winter, and that if they're in the top box, they're going to starve. I don't know. I've never seen them in the bottom box, so I couldn't say what happens when they're in the bottom box. They're never there. Not going into winter, they aren't. And yes, I've seen them starve and not starve, both. So, but they're always in the top box when that happens. I don't know. Maybe that's not true everywhere. Maybe that's only true in Nebraska. I don't know. It might have to do with locale, just because of how cold it gets and how the the thermodynamics of the hive work. I don't know. So how strong should they be going into winter is one of the issues. There's a lot of people who are really in a big hurry to combine their 2-week hives because they think that'll give them a better chance of getting through the winter. And that's possible. That's a judgment call. It's one of those judgment calls you'll make a lot better after you've experimented and tried a few things and seen how it works out in your climate. But I've more and more over the years tried to overwinter smaller and smaller hives, and although I do lose more of the small hives than I do the big hives, I kind of think it's worth the risk, because some of those come out in the spring and really do well. So I tend less and less to combine hives in the fall to try and get them through winter. But it's true, if you only got, you know, literally a handful of bees like this, they're probably not going to make it through the winter. You might, if you got another handful of bees and another handful of bees, maybe you ought to put all three of those together. Maybe they might make it to spring. But if you got I've seen a softball size nuke, if they're up against each other to keep each other warm, I've seen those make it through the winter if it's not too brutal of a winter in my location. So I tend more and more to try and overwinter them and see what happens rather than just combine them. But that's a judgment call. You might want to try going both ways and see what you think, because it's going to kind of depend on your climate. How small is too small to make it through the winter? That's the question. And then if they're too small to make it through the winter, then maybe you want to combine them with another colony. Entrance reducers. Everybody always asks me if I reduce the entrances on my top entrances. Well, about half of them are reduced and half of them aren't. And I probably should reduce them all. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I'd recommend you do it. And if I ever get time, I'll do the rest of mine. That's probably what I think. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think all in all, over the years, I used to always see a traffic jam as a bad thing and I'd want to open it up. But I'm not so sure. I've seen some really thriving hives that are in an out yard that I left for Afghanistan for 3 years and came back, and they still had a 2-inch wide opening, and they were thriving and doing really well with a little tiny opening, and made a lot of honey when I piled a lot of supers on there. And so I'm not convinced that they necessarily need this big wide opening. I'm not so sure they don't do better with a little one. It's what they typically have in a tree. They typically pick a tree that has a pretty small opening, and they're usually pretty happy with it. But we're determined that we think that's a traffic jam. We want to improve the workflow, so, yes.
Well, I have a comment about that with, if you have a bottom entrance, that they can get jammed in there. I've had 2 hives die.
Oh, well, that's,
I just wanted to mention, if you have a bottom entrance, then entrance reducer can kill the hive if enough bees die and block the entrance and they can't get out and you don't notice.
well,
It's happened to me twice.
part of that is that most people aren't using it right. You should put it so that the opening is at the top of the
Okay.
reducer, so the dead bees are at the bottom and they can still get out the top. But the other thing is, that's one of the reasons I like a top entrance instead of a bottom entrance. I never have the problem that the top entrance gets clogged up with dead bees. It never happens. And it also never gets clogged up with grass. In the summer, when the grass grows up and starts blocking the entrance to get into the hive, I never have that problem with the top entrance. So I like my top entrances. I don't have to mow. I'm not there. They still got good access to this nice entrance. And the dead bees never pile up, and all the moisture can get out, and so on and so forth. So, I sometimes feed pollen in the fall. I try to keep some in the freezer in case this situation comes up. But I usually don't do this unless I have a failed fall flow. If the fall flow fails, I have the problem that I need enough young bees going into winter that can make it through the spring. So if the fall flow fails and they quit raising brood in July and they still haven't raised any brood, I got a bunch of old bees come fall, and I need them to raise a batch of brood. So when I see them get desperate and they're in my chicken feed trying to gather all the chicken dust and they're messing with my sawdust where I'm cutting wood, I figure they're desperate for pollen, and so I'll just put some pollen in an open hive. Somehow I have trouble getting this across to people. I'm talking about an empty hive, no bees, put a solid bottom board down, put a screen bottom board on top of that, put a piece of window screen on top of that, dump all the pollen on top of that, put a box on top of that, and put a cover on top of that. And then the bees can come and go and get the pollen as they want, and that's just to keep the rain out. The screen is to keep it off the bottom because it'll get moldy if I put it on the bottom. It gets up where the water won't get in the pollen and make it mold. That's what the screen's for. And then the lid and the cover in the box is just to make space here that's out of the weather so it's not getting rained on, right? Because if I put it out in the open, it'll just get rained on. Even in Nebraska, it rains occasionally. Very occasionally compared to here, but it does rain. And then I ruined a whole bunch of pollen, which I went to a lot of trouble to gather, and I consider it fairly valuable. I could be selling it for, I don't know what it sells for, $6 or $7 or $12 a pound or something, I don't know. I'm never selling it, but if I were, there's no point wasting it. I've got pollen I've gathered. Now to gather pollen, you need to get pollen traps, and you'd have to run them some of the time and collect some pollen. But I'm not interested in doing pollen all the time. I'm just interested in having some in the freezer in case I get a failed fall flow.
Can I regress back a little bit there about the entrances? One of my friends there, he has drilling holes in the side of it and about in the middle for an entrance versus the top or bottom entrance.
Well, the bees will like it fine, but I hate holes in my boxes, so I never drill holes in my boxes anymore. Now, if you come and look at my boxes, you'll find some holes in them, and you'll say, see, you do drill holes in your boxes, and I'll say, yeah, that's how I learned not to drill holes in my boxes. They're always getting in the way, you know, you say, oh, I'm going to put a bee escape on here, and then you forget that there's a hole in that stupid box, because you didn't see it, and the next thing you know, it's all getting robbed out, and you wished you'd never done that. Or you go to pick up a box you think doesn't have any holes in it, and the hole's right under the handle, and you stick your finger right there where the guard bee is, and it's done. Or you load it up in your car thinking there's no holes in the boxes, and you seal off the entrance. And my bee vehicle is a minivan, you know, so all of a sudden you got a huge cloud of bees in the back, and you're going, where did they come from? Oh, yeah, well, there's a hole in the box. So that's the reasons why I don't like holes in boxes. I'll show you it in a little while, I think, here. A windbreak's probably a good thing. I've never actually had the time to set one up. It's another one of those things, yeah, I think it's a great idea. No, I've never done it. Do I think it would be worth the effort? Probably, and if I ever find the time, I'll do that. I planted a bunch of trees that hopefully will make a better windbreak for where I have them, but they haven't grown up very big yet, so they haven't done a whole lot. I've thought about just putting up some T-posts and some plywood just to block the wind. But maybe it's better just to slow it down, because the problem with putting up T-posts and that, and then you get 100-mile-an-hour sheer wind, I'm afraid it's just going to blow sheets of plywood everywhere or blow the whole thing over. I don't know.
How about shipping pallets?
Yeah, pallets would probably be a good idea. Just wire some pallets to those posts. That would probably be a good idea. Because then it'll let a little wind through so the pressure doesn't build up too much, but it'll slow it down. Where I come from, that would basically make a snow fence, and so you have to judge it correctly or you'll bury them in the snow. It's funny, I've got a brother-in-law who likes to pull tricks on people all the time, so he's always teasing them and telling them things like Part-3. And so somebody was with him who kind of knew that about him, and they're riding along, and they had some snow fence along the side of the road, which at the time most of it was corn cribbing. You know, they just take corn cribbing, which is like lath that's wired together, for those of you who are too young to have ever seen corn cribbing. But they had, you know, they put fences up like that all the time in Nebraska, because it slows down the wind enough, then the snow will fall out right here next to the fence and not cover the road. So, and they put them up in the fall, and they take them down in the spring sometimes. So anyway, there's all the snow fence. So they asked him, well, what's that snow fence for? So he's, you know, or what's that fence for, is what they asked him. And he said, well, that's a snake fence. I said, well, what do you mean? Oh, it's to keep the snakes out. And I said, well, no, that hole's too big. The snake can get through there. He said, you're right. I'm sorry. He says, it's a snow fence. Well, they never would believe him, because now he'd already told them the story of the snake fence, so they never did believe it was a snow fence. But it really is a snow fence. That's like when I lived in Laramie, they had these poles that were 30 feet high tied to the signs on the side of the road. And those are there so the snowplows can find the road, because the drifts get that deep. But you tell somebody that, and they think you're making it up. But it's true. those are so the snowplows can find the road when it's drifted over 30 feet. But yeah, nobody ever believes you. But probably those snow fences would make a good windbreak. If you just put up, and they make them now out of plastic that are like almost, I don't know, it's almost kind of a plastic cloth that's fluorescent orange. I don't know why it's always fluorescent orange, but they make a snow fence you can buy that you can put up that would probably help.
Silk fence, they
Wait.
call it here.
Soap fence?
Silt.
Silt fence. Oh, it's to keep the dust from going. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have snow, we have mud.
You don't have to have 8-frame boxes to overwinter by any means, but I think they winter a little better. the cluster tends to fit the box better. This is the same argument the worry people have is, why don't we make the box to fit the cluster that typically is going through the winter, and then they would, it would fit them better. This is typically about what a hollow tree is, but I think that's kind of a silly argument to say what a hollow tree typically is when a hollow tree could be anywhere from this to this, and anywhere from this to this, and it could be a hollow limb going out this way, and it could be, so I don't know if it's very accurate to say what a hollow tree usually is, but all in all, the cluster does seem to fit the box better, and they don't tend to leave food behind so much, they tend to fill the box better. Medium boxes, I think, overwinter a little better because the cluster usually spans more than one box, and if you think about these walls of bees, these walls of comb in between the bees that are clustered in it, some bees that are on a deep frame and they're over here and the cluster is contracting have to go either around one of the ends or the bottom or the top to get over to the next one, and they have to leave the cluster to do that. And if it's really cold, they often can't do that. And usually when the cluster's suddenly contracting, it's because it suddenly got really cold. It's usually because it dropped down to 20 below and all of a sudden the cluster's starting to contract, and these bees over here will get stuck sometimes. Well, on a medium, it's usually the cluster is usually spanning two boxes, and there's the gap between the boxes here. And so these bees over here can move over to the next cluster because there's a gap running through the cluster this way. So I think they overwinter slightly better. I wouldn't say that it's significant enough that I'd change over my boxes just for that purpose. I change over my boxes so I don't have to lift up heavy boxes, but I think the narrow frames overwinter better and they come into spring better because they can cover more brood. If you've got an 1.25 inch frame, you have less bees required to fill this gap that's between them to keep the brood warm. Again, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't convert just for that, but that's one good reason to go to an 1.25 inch. I've been overwintering nukes for a while. I think it's a good idea. Success varies depending on how rough the winter is. I don't usually recommend some of the things I'm doing for nukes for hives because I think it's just not worth the effort. But huddling them together and providing a little bit of heat can be helpful, but the heat really needs to be thermostatically controlled and it needs to be pretty minimal because I'm not trying to keep them warm. I'm just trying to mitigate that 27 below night. I just want them to not freeze to death. I don't want them to get active. I don't want them to get woke up and active and burning a lot of honey. I just want to get them through those 27 below nights. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if we take that stand I talked about before that's 4 foot by 8 foot and I have them all clustered together, if you move them to the outside and leave that 8-inch gap in the middle and put some styrofoam on the bottom and some styrofoam on the top and some styrofoam on the ends and stick a little thermostatically controlled electric heater in there, like you can buy from Walmart for 20 bucks or whatever, and set the thermostat on about 40 or 50. Basically, it's just going to provide a little bit of heat in the back so that on those 27 below nights, there's something that's not 27 below feeding some heat into the system. I wouldn't do much more than that, but I've tried overwintering queen banks. If you get a terrarium heater pad and put in them, basically you've got to keep a queen bank warm enough. So if you're going to overwinter them, you've got to keep them warm enough that they don't cluster. But if you keep them warm enough they don't cluster, they don't live as long. So basically you've got to plan on somewhere in the middle of winter you're going to have to boost them with a few more bees from one of your other hives in order to get them all the way to spring. So if you have a terrarium heater to keep them from clustering and you've got some bees to add in about January or so, you can actually get a queen bank through the winter. In case you're interested. I've never really done any indoor wintering. I've been talking to people about it for 40 years. All I'll say about it is it's a lot more complicated than you think, and I do a lot of research on it before you try it, and I do small experiments until you get the hang of it. Because you could very easily end up with a huge unmitigated disaster if you make a very small mistake. It's a lot trickier than you think it is. The bees are generating heat. The bees are generating moisture. The bees are generating CO2. The bees need a certain amount of oxygen. The people who build buildings to put lots of beehives in usually have a problem keeping them cool, not keeping them warm. Keeping them warm is never the issue. It's keeping them ventilated enough that they have enough oxygen and cool enough that they don't get overheated. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for you, kind of maybe a little bit backing up there. Have you, I forget, I was laughing I'm sorry. Have you, when you're talking about banking queens, what about like on a queen castle, a two-frame queen castle in a regular deep box? Are you able to do that, or is there just not enough in there?
Are you just trying to get the nuke through the winter with the queen loose? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I've thought about trying it here. I didn't do it this year, but I'm really looking at trying it for next year. But a two-frame, you know, when you get a bunch of extra queens and you're thinking maybe I'll put them in the spring, if I don't get enough bees.
But are we talking about 20 queens in one two-frame nuke? Or are we
No,
talking
no,
about
not 20, one queen
queen
in
in
two
each?
frames, and then each box has got about,
In
maybe
your
3 or 4.
climate, I think with a terrarium heater under it, they'd probably do fine.
Okay. You haven't tried anything like that in your area?
No, I don't.
Just out of
think-
curiosity?
I don't think
Okay.
they'd make it in my area. 2 frames would be enough to
Right.
keep
Okay.
them warm.
Okay.
Even with a terrarium heater, I'm not sure it'd be enough to keep them warm in my
Right.
climate.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Observation hives. I have observation hives in my living room. I overwinter every winter. I say that I don't have one in my new house. I just moved to my new house. I don't have it set up yet. But observation hives need a little bit of help anyway. So you probably end up having to feed them. You probably end up having to boost them with a little bit of bees in the spring to get them going again because they tend to dwindle a lot. But you can overwinter them. There is the confusion that they're inside and they may get confused somewhat, but they pretty much know it's cold outside. They don't tend to fly, they tend to stay inside. They're just more active, which makes them a little more short-lived, which means you might have to boost them just like the queen bank. You might have to boost them a little in maybe March. I might have to take a handful of bees and put them in a nuke, and I'll just put that nuke with no frames in it up against the tube. I'll have probably a round hole in the nuke and up against the tube, and then these bees will smell the queen in there and they'll all just move in. So I don't have to take them outside or anything, and I'll give them a few more bees. I guess that's what I had on wintering. Any other questions?
I have a question. So the Germans and the Slovenians are keeping bees in houses, but they have like what the A to Z hive, what they open from the back. Does that make a difference in the heating? Because the whole front is open, right, to the
Well,
outside?
I don't know if it makes a difference in heating, but it sure makes a difference in how you can manage them. It's always, you gotta, if you're gonna try and do indoor wintering, you're gonna have to think through all the logistics that are involved and what it is you're trying to do, because some people, their object is, if you keep these bees in complete darkness, and you don't let them fly at all, and you never let them get above 40, and they never try to raise any brood, they won't need any cleansing flights, and I can actually keep them confined until next spring. That's one method. Another method is I'm going to let them be free-flying all winter, but now the problem is if I go in there and I open a hive, now I got bees loose in my building. And the Slovenians and most of those guys, they basically got a building that's sort of like that empty gap behind my 2 rows of hives except wider. You've got a gap you can walk down behind the hives to work all the hives, but it's kind of open on both ends. So whatever bees get out
Go back around.
can go back around, and they don't have to lift any boxes because the AZ hive basically opens in the back, and it's like you pull the frames out this way. And so it's more like working a chest of drawers than it is working a hive, which sounds like a brilliant way to do it. I'd love to work one time and see if it's how big a pain all the propolis and the other issues are, but it seems like a wonderful design for a hive, because I love the idea of a hive I don't have to lift a box.
Right.
I've been trying to get to where I had a hive I never had to lift a box for a lot of years, and so that one intrigues me a lot. I wish somebody would manufacture one here. What little bit of information I can find about it, I don't think I have enough that I'm confident that what I build would be the same as what they have. You know, I mean, I've seen some plans, but they seem to be, I don't know, I think there's some gaps in there. I don't know.
Yeah, they have them. I've seen one for sale on eBay, and
Really?
I've wondered about. I mean, I've wanted to do it, but I'm like, but do I need the house?
I'd like to try one. No, you wouldn't have to have it in the house to do it. That's just how they're doing it.
Right, just
That's
a
part of
covered
the reason
shed.
for the design.
Yeah.
The problem with putting them in a house too, though, is that on a warm day when they might have got some sun and warmed up enough to do a cleansing flight, they might not get warmed up because they're in the shade, because they're in the building. So I don't know how that'll, you know, there's a lot of complexities to once you start putting them inside that are not obvious until you do it. And that's why I would experiment on a small scale until you figure it out. And I talked to a lot of people who are doing it. There's people on BeeSource and other places who actually do this every year up in Canada and Montana and some places like that. And they've kind of worked out the details in the long run, and it's all in the details. It's not in the big picture. In fact, almost everything in life you'll find is that way. It's not the big picture idea that makes it work or not work. It's all in the details that makes it work or not work. And you need to get the details worked out. Yeah. I think indoor wintering would be something worth pursuing where I am in order to get nukes through the winter. I don't really, if the hive can't make it through the winter, I don't really want those genetics anyway. But the nukes, I'm kind of pushing my luck trying to get a bunch of queens through the spring so I can sell them to people and have some local bees that went through the winter instead of just some packages from California. So they may need some help because it's not their fault they're a little tiny nuke trying to get through the winter. Okay?
What's your experience using sawdust, wood chips, something like that as moisture control in the winter?
I think it serves as insulation, and I think insulation serves to cut down on condensation, but I don't see any way it can absorb all the moisture that the bees produce in the course of a winter. The bees produce gallons of water in the course of a winter, and it's got to go someplace, and that sawdust can't hold it all, so it must be going someplace else when you're doing that. It must not be staying in the sawdust. I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea. I played with it a little bit, and I wasn't that impressed one way or the other. To me, it wasn't a bad idea. It was just more work that didn't really accomplish anything in a positive direction that was worth the effort. The top entrance was easier for me to manage and easier for me to build and easier for me to maintain, and it seemed to accomplish the same thing, which is to get rid of the condensation. But you know, I'm in a different location than you are too. And in my climate, it might be a different outcome than in your climate. So I'd experiment and see what you think.
It works here.
Okay. I won't argue with that. It very well might work well here. I don't know.
Well, my second question is in terms of how do you deal with ventilation in the winter in a top bar?
I have a top entrance on my top bar hives. I know that seems contradictory, but it's really not that hard. Let me see if I can find it here. I don't know if I have the latest one here or not. The latest one has a better diagram, but let's see what I got here. I don't know if we have an internet connection here. This is just the pages from my website without the internet. URST, top bar hives. Now I don't seem to have the picture on here because it didn't load it. Do we have an internet connection here? No.
There should be.
But this would be on your website.
Yeah, that would be on my website, and there's a better picture of how it is. But basically, the biggest problem with trying to explain the top entrance on my top bar hive is that it's too simple for people to grasp. Because all it is you've got no, didn't find that. All you've got is you've got these bars coming across here, and they start somewhere, so you put this one tight and you run them all the way across here. You're going to have a gap when you get done. It's never going to come out perfect. That's the entrance. That's all there is to it. My cover is just a flat piece of wood on top of this, and so you've got the edge of the cover, you've got the bar sitting on top of the edge, and then you've got the cover sitting on top of that, so that leaves a gap this way. And then the bar being back from the front leaves a gap this way, and that's the entrance. There's no holes, there's nothing, there's just a gap at the beginning. And that's my top entrance.
It sounds like you're just leaving.
Right. It's way more complicated than I would build.
Another question on wintering.
Or slide it to one side, and maybe it'll make enough of a gap that can come up and around. But, yeah.
Over here.
I've had great success overwintering my bees through winter, only to have them crash when the spring weather starts in March. Is that just the queen genetics I'm running into, or do you have any other suggestions for me?
Are they starving?
No.
Really?
And I only feed natural pollen and honey, what they bring in.
That's an odd time for them to crash. It's not an odd time for them to starve, because...
I've already learned the starvation
Yeah,
thing. So
because when they're feeding brood, they burn through a lot of storage really fast. So they'll go through the whole winter and burn up almost nothing, and then they start raising brood and go through a whole bunch.
yeah, and then I go in and I open it up on a nice day in March, and it's like, where's the queen, where's the brood? We're just dwindling away at that point.
Maybe your queens are failing before you get to spring, and that's why they're not kicking off in the spring.
Yeah, so.
I don't know. You could try. I tend to let them raise their own queens and not try to requeen them. But if that's a consistent problem you're having, you might try forcing them to raise a new queen the ideal time would be 2 weeks before the main flow, because there's plenty of stuff coming in. The queen gets well fed, and it's a great time for a brood break and actually maximize your honey. So if you could predict when the main flow is going to hit, and make them queenless 2 weeks before the main flow, and let them raise a new queen. They'll have a nice young queen going into winter, and maybe that'll help with your problem. I don't know.
I haven't been able to tack it down to any one thing, so I wanted to hear what you had to, any ideas you had, so thank you.
Well, if I was consistently having that problem, that's probably what I would try.
For the most
But
part,
I don't-
swarms or even the second year over winter.
Yeah.
Have you ever overwintered queenless hives?
I never tried it. If I knew they were queenless, I'd just combine them with a queen right one. Usually I have enough nukes around. It's easy enough for me to combine it with a queen right nuke, and then they're not queenless, and then I can go from there. But could they get through the winter? I don't know. They're going to fail in the spring if I don't do something. So, a lot of what you do depends on what you have for resources. If you got 200 hives, you got resources. If you got 2 hives, you don't have so many resources. So a lot of your decisions are driven by what you have for resources, which is another reason to have a couple of nukes around. You have more resources, even though you don't have a lot of hives, it gives you some resources to play with that you weren't planning on that being a hive. You just got something you can use to your advantage. Okay, any other, shall we take a quick break and start on another topic? Why don't you